Imagine you're just walking down the street,
Yeah.
enjoying a perfectly normal afternoon, and you suddenly spot a political yard sign for a candidate you absolutely despise.
Oh, yeah. We've all been there.
Right. And your heart rate immediately spikes, your chest tightens up, your jaw clenches. But what if I told you that physical reaction isn't actually political at all?
I mean, it feels political in the moment.
Exactly. But what if that visceral response is like the exact same biological reflex your brain uses to stop you from drinking sour milk or eating poisoned food?
It completely upends the way we think about civic discourse, doesn't it? Because we have this culturally ingrained expectation that political disagreements are supposed to operate like a formal debate.
Yeah, totally.
We assume both sides are listening to facts, processing them logically, and arriving at a reasoned conclusion.
We really want to believe we're in the driver's seat of our own opinions. But when you look at the actual neuroscience, that rational debate stage just collapses.
Right.
We are dealing with a landscape driven by hidden chemical reactions and biological puppet strings. And so that is the core of what we are exploring today in this deep dive.
It's a really fascinating topic.
It is. We're analyzing a highly provocative op-ed published back in November 2020 on counterpunch.org by the scholar J.P. Linstroth. It's titled History and Science as Candles in the Dark.
And, Linstroth's approach here is incredibly ambitious. He attempts to synthesize neurobiology, social network theory, and centuries of history to diagnose the extreme political polarization surrounding the 2020 U.S. election.
He's basically trying to explain the mechanics of mass division. But before we go any further, we need to establish the parameters of this deep dive.
Definitely.
The source material we are examining today is intensely politically charged. It contains very strong anti-Trump and pro-Biden sentiments. So I want to be clear to you, the listener. Our role here is absolutely never to take a side.
Right. We are just the messengers.
Exactly. We are going to impartially report on Linstroth's perspective. You'll hear us use framing like Linstroth argues or according to the op-ed, so you know exactly whose ideas these are. We are simply unpacking the mechanics of his argument, remaining entirely neutral.
Because analyzing the architecture of an argument like this, seeing how someone connects brain chemistry to the Founding Fathers to modern media is an incredibly valuable exercise, regardless of where anyone falls on the political spectrum.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start with the immediate context of November 2020. Joe Biden had just secured 279 electoral votes, crossing the threshold to win the presidency.
Yeah.
And simultaneously, Donald Trump and millions of his supporters were vehemently claiming the election was rigged or stolen. So Linstroth looks at this seemingly impenetrable divide and concludes that traditional political science just cannot explain it.
No, he argues we have to dig deeper. To understand the friction, according to Linstroth, we have to look at our fundamental primate biology.
Which is wild to think about.
It is. He strips away the veneer of modern civilization to remind us that we are, at our core, primates. And primates are biologically hardwired to react to tribal symbols.
So he's saying a political sign isn't just a sign.
Exactly. Linstroth argues that a MAGA hat or a Biden-Harris bumper sticker isn't processed by the brain as a simple statement of policy preference. The primate brain perceives those items as profound, flashing signals of us versus them.
It functions like a biological tripwire.
That's a great way to put it.
You plant a yard sign, and you aren't just making a statement, you are setting a tripwire for your neighbor's nervous system. Linstroth grounds this concept in the work of neurobiologist Robert Sapolsky, specifically his book, Behave.
Sapolsky's work is crucial here.
Right, and this is where we have to look at the amygdala. We often hear the amygdala described as the fear center of the brain. But Sapolsky points out a crucial secondary function. The exact same neural hardware that processes terror and anxiety is inextricably linked to the hardware that controls aggression.
Fear and aggression are neurobiologically twinned. So, according to Linstroth, when political figures or media outlets engage in deliberate fear-mongering, they are sending electrical impulses directly into the amygdala.
They're basically hacking the brain.
Basically, yeah. Because of how our brains are structured, it's a biological inevitability that for a significant portion of the population, that engineered panic will seamlessly convert into hostility and violence. The brain perceives a threat to the tribe and literally prepares for physical combat.
Wait, the insular cortex plays into this too, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because Linstroth brings up this region of the brain, and the mechanics of it are staggering.
Oh, the insular cortex part is mind-blowing.
It's the brain's poison detector, right?
Yeah.
It's the region that lights up and makes you physically gag when you smell rotten meat. It evolved to protect early hominids from ingesting fatal pathogens.
Yeah, and Linstroth highlights this fascinating evolutionary detour. Over millions of years, as human societies became more complex, we didn't evolve a brand new brain region to handle complex social disagreements.
We just used what was already there.
Exactly. The brain just repurposed the insular cortex.
Right.
So today, the exact same neural pathways that trigger gustatory disgust, like the urge to vomit to expel poison, are activated when we feel moral disgust toward our political opponents.
I want you listening right now to really process the implications of that. Think about the last time you were scrolling through your feed and encountered a political post you found morally reprehensible.
You get that visceral reaction.
Yes, that tight chest, that spike in blood pressure that wasn't your intellect engaging. That was your insular cortex treating a political opinion as a literal physical pathogen.
It's treating an idea like bad food.
Right. According to Linstroth's framework, trying to use logical debate on someone whose insular cortex is firing is utterly useless. Their brain is reacting to your data points the same way it reacts to swallowing spoiled milk.
And the neurochemical cocktail gets even more volatile when we factor in oxytocin. Popular culture usually labels oxytocin the cuddle hormone.
Yeah, it has a very warm, fuzzy reputation. We associate it with maternal bonding, falling in love.
Building trust, right. But Linstroth shatters that reputation by citing a 2013 study by Merolla and colleagues. The researchers discovered that oxytocin is heavily context-dependent.
So it's not always the good guy?
Not at all. It does enhance social bonding and trust, but strictly within your own perceived group. If you are given oxytocin, you might become more trusting of your own government or your own community.
Okay, that makes sense.
But here's the catch. That same chemical surge simultaneously increases belligerence, defensive aggression, and unconscious biases against anyone perceived as an outsider.
Oh, wow. So the biological mechanism for loving your family is the exact same mechanism for going to war with the neighboring village.
Yes. To protect the in-group, the brain heightens hostility toward the out-group. It is a biological double-edged sword.
So if we accept Linstroth's premise that our brains are packed with these biological tripwires, that we're primed for tribalism, fear-based aggression, and moral disgust, we then have to examine the environment those brains operate in.
Because the environment is a huge factor.
Right. Linstroth shifts his focus from our internal neurobiology to the modern media landscape, arguing that our current communication platforms are perfectly engineered to exploit this specific chemistry.
He describes 24-hour news cycles and social media as completely toxic. And to illustrate how massive this shift is, he contrasts modern platforms with older theories of media manipulation.
Like Chomsky.
Exactly. For decades, academics relied on Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky's 1988 concept of manufacturing consent. Chomsky argued that elite institutions subtly manipulate mass media from the top down to control public narrative.
To maintain the status quo, basically.
Right. But Linstroth argues that we have blown completely past Chomsky's model. Herman and Chomsky were analyzing newspapers and television broadcasts. They couldn't have anticipated the algorithmic architecture of platforms like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or TikTok.
Yeah, drawing on the documentary The Social Dilemma, Linstroth points out that these modern platforms don't just subtly persuade. They operate from the bottom up by tracking our behavior and feeding us stimuli specifically designed to trigger the amygdala.
And he also pulls from Charles Kadushin's book, Understanding Social Networks, and the PBS documentary Networld.
Sociologically, humans naturally aggregate around similar ideas, right?
Exactly. We want to be around people who validate our worldview because it provides a comforting hit of oxytocin. The algorithms map this desire and hyper-accelerate it, locking us into impenetrable echo chambers.
So we get the chemical reward of tribal belonging, constantly contrasted with engineered fear of the other side. But I have to push back on this narrative of technological exceptionalism for a second.
What do you mean?
Is the algorithm actually altering human nature? Or does the broader scope of history prove that we've always been this vulnerable to mass hysteria? Blaming TikTok or cable news feels a bit like historical amnesia. Haven't we always formed violent mobs based on bad information?
What's fascinating here is that Linstroth anticipates that exact critique. He absolutely agrees that fake news and mass manipulation are not modern inventions at all.
Okay, so he acknowledges the history.
He does. To prove that technology merely changes the velocity of our panic rather than the nature of it, he drops a historical anchor all the way back to the European witch craze.
Oh, that's a wild parallel.
Mm-hmm.
He specifically zeroes in on England between 1645 and 1647, relying on the work of the prominent historian Sir Hugh Trevor Roper.
Right, and to understand the mechanisms of that era, we have to look at the Counter-Reformation. This was a period of intense religious upheaval and paranoia as the Catholic Church aggressively pushed back against the Protestant Reformation.
A lot of societal stress.
Tons. Add to that the rise of Puritanism in England, a movement demanding extreme moral purity and hypervigilance against sin. The population was already terrified, seeing the devil's influence in everyday misfortunes.
And into that powder keg of biological fear, you introduce the printing press. Linstroth argues the printing press acted exactly like a 17th century social media algorithm.
It really did.
It allowed sensational, completely fabricated pamphlets about witches to spread virally. The publishers realized that terrifying stories sold more copies. They literally monetized the amygdala.
And Trevor Roper's historical analysis details how this pamphlet-driven madness led to the execution of roughly 40,000 people across Europe.
40,000? That's horrifying.
And the vast majority were marginalized women, executed on entirely bogus charges of witchcraft. The fundamental human flaw, the tendency to let fear override logic, was exactly the same. The printing press just allowed the hysteria to scale up.
Linstroth reinforces this recurring tragedy by quoting the astronomer Carl Sagan. Sagan observed that humans have a devastating tendency to make the exact same mistakes again and again.
We never seem to learn.
No. Whenever we feel deeply threatened, we regress. We abandon critical thinking and become easily manipulated into horrific senselessness.
And if the media, whether it's a 17th century pamphlet or a 21st century algorithm, is constantly stoking our amygdala, that resulting aggression demands a target. We need somewhere to aim our moral disgust.
Right, the energy has to go somewhere.
According to Linstroth, we create these targets by severely distorting history and weaponizing political labels.
Yeah, the op-ed takes a hard look at how words like socialism and conservatism have been totally hollowed out. They are no longer functional descriptors of economic or political theory.
They're just triggers.
Exactly. They are just triggers designed to signify the outgroup. Linstroth starts by deconstructing our modern mythology surrounding the Founding Fathers. Today, they are frequently invoked as the ultimate paragons of traditional, cautious conservatism.
But Linstroth points out that taking such a view strips away all historical context. In the late 18th century, the European ruling classes viewed the American founders as dangerous, system-destroying radicals.
They were the extremists of their day.
Absolutely. When Thomas Jefferson wrote "All men are created equal" in the Declaration of Independence, he was heavily adapting the concepts of the English philosopher John Locke.
Specifically, Locke's two treatises of government, published in 1689. Locke argued for equality in the state of nature and the idea that governments only exist by the consent of the governed.
Which sounds completely normal to us now.
We hear that today and shrug. But to a 17th or 18th century monarch whose entire authority rested on the divine right of kings, Locke's philosophy was essentially a call for anarchy. It was terrifyingly progressive.
Yet we conveniently ignore that radicalism to make the label fit modern tribal narratives. Linstroth traces this habit of historical distortion forward, particularly focusing on the American tradition of communist scares.
Oh, Red Scares, yeah.
He views these panics as recurring manifestations of the witch craze mentality, where complex global anxieties are projected onto vulnerable populations.
He brings up the Palmer raids as a primary example of this. Between 1919 and 1920, following the Russian Revolution and a series of domestic anarchist bombings, the U.S. government just panicked.
Under Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer.
Right. Federal agents conducted massive, often warrantless raids. They arrested thousands of people. But Linstroth emphasizes who was targeted. Overwhelmingly, it was Italian and Eastern European Jewish immigrants. The fear of communism was deeply entwined with xenophobia.
And the op-ed follows this historical thread to Senator Joseph McCarthy in the aftermath of World War II. During the dawn of the atomic age, when existential fear was at an all-time high, McCarthy launched baseless crusades against supposed communist infiltrators.
It was a literal witch hunt.
Exactly. He ruined the lives and careers of Hollywood artists, academics, and government officials almost entirely without evidence. The label of communist was enough to trigger the biological tripwire and bypass any need for due process.
And Linstroth argues this exact same machinery was deployed during the 2020 election.
How so?
Well, he points to political messaging in South Florida's Hispanic communities, arguing that voters were subjected to a targeted campaign designed to falsely equate a potential Joe Biden administration with the authoritarian communist regimes of Cuba's Fidel Castro and Venezuela's Hugo Chavez.
Oh, I see.
In the author's view, it was a deliberate manipulation of generational trauma using an empty label. Again, we're just conveying his argument here.
Understood. And Linstroth extends this critique to prominent media figures, too, specifically naming Fox News commentator Tucker Carlson.
Right.
The op-ed claims that Carlson routinely weaponized labels by suggesting COVID-19 public health restrictions or turning the United States into China, while simultaneously vilifying Dr. Anthony Fauci.
So the same fear tactics.
Yeah, Linstroth perceives this rhetoric not as political commentary, but as the direct modern equivalent of the pamphlet-driven hysteria that fueled the witch trials.
To further demonstrate how detached our political labels have become from historical reality, Linstroth introduces what we might call the FDR paradox.
Oh, this part is really telling.
Today, the word socialism is frequently used as a blanket insult for any government intervention in the economy. Yet Linstroth looks at Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the 32nd president, the man who led the country through the Great Depression and World War II, and the only president elected 4 times.
Relying on the work of renowned historian H.W. Brands, Linstroth makes the case that FDR actually saved the capitalist system from total collapse.
And the irony is huge.
Huge, because the mechanism he used to save capitalism was a suite of programs that many modern critics would instantly brand as pure socialism.
Right. During his famous first 100 days, which literally set the benchmark by which every subsequent president is judged, FDR fundamentally restructured the relationship between the government and the economy.
He created the alphabet agencies.
Exactly. He created the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, to strictly regulate Wall Street and prevent another stock market crash. He created the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, to guarantee bank deposits so citizens wouldn't lose their life savings.
And Social Security, too.
Yes, he eventually implemented Social Security to create a federal safety net for the elderly. These were massive, unprecedented government interventions into the free market.
But they were implemented to stabilize and rescue capitalism, not destroy it. Linstroth uses this to highlight how completely unmoored our modern arguments over socialism are from the actual history of American governance.
Here's where it gets really interesting. This historical fluidity perfectly sets up the ship of Theseus analogy for American political parties.
It's a great philosophical puzzle.
It is. The ancient thought experiment asks, if you have a wooden ship, and over a century you slowly replace every single rotting board, the mast, the sails, is it still the same ship? Or is it something entirely new, operating under the old name?
And Linstroth points out that both major political parties are basically the ship of Theseus. The Republican Party of Abraham Lincoln in the 1860s is completely unrecognizable from the Republican Party of today.
And the Democrats, too.
Right. The Democratic Party has radically shifted its voting base, its geographical strongholds, and its economic platform multiple times over the last century.
So if a political party changes its voters, its underlying philosophy, and its core policies, aren't we just fighting to the death over an empty trademark?
That's the implication.
We are letting our insular cortex flood our bodies with stress hormones over labels that don't even mean what they meant 50 years ago.
And that historical amnesia makes every current event feel like an unprecedented existential threat. For example, Linstroth notes that the media narrative surrounding the 2020 election framed a president losing a second term as a shocking anomaly.
Which just isn't true.
Not at all. In reality, Donald Trump is the 11th one-term president in U.S. history. He joins a very crowded, normal historical list that includes John Adams, Herbert Hoover, Jimmy Carter, and George H.W. Bush. The biological tribalism blinds us to the mundane reality of history.
Wow.
This raises an important question, which sits at the very heart of Linstroth's anxiety. If our biology is working against us, and our media is profiting from that biology, how do we pull back from the edge?
It seems like an impossible knot to untie.
Linstroth argues that intellectuals, scholars, and educated citizens have a moral imperative to find a way to communicate effectively with working-class Americans to break this cycle of manipulation. In his assessment, failing to bridge this gap places the country perilously close to another civil war.
And to show just how difficult that bridging will be, Linstroth includes a remarkably candid admission about his own brain.
Yeah, he gets very personal here.
Despite being a scholar actively researching and writing about biological tribalism, he confesses that when he sees a red MAGA hat, he has a visceral reaction. He writes that he literally sees the letters transpose in his mind to read, "I am a racist."
And regardless of how one views that statement politically, it serves as a profound illustration of his core thesis. It demonstrates how deeply entrenched these tribal markers are.
Even the experts aren't immune.
Right. Even a researcher who is consciously aware of the amygdala's tricks cannot stop his own primate brain from instantly interpreting a piece of clothing as a severe moral threat. The tripwire catches everyone.
That candidness brings us to his ultimate conclusion. How does Linstroth believe a society survives this combination of primal biology and high-tech manipulation?
He draws inspiration from Joe Biden's acceptance speech in November 2020, where Biden called for a time to heal and urged the nation to marshal the forces of science and hope. Linstroth explicitly connects this political rhetoric to the philosophy of Carl Sagan, specifically Sagan's book, The Demon-Haunted World.
The subtitle of that book actually gives Linstroth's op-ed its name, right? Science is a candle in the dark.
Exactly. Linstroth's closing argument is that the only barrier between a functional society and the enveloping darkness of our worst, most violent instincts is rigorous education.
It all comes back to education.
It does. He believes we must actively train citizens in the scientific method, teaching them how to evaluate evidence and dismiss falsehoods, while simultaneously grounding them in the historical democratic principles of the Bill of Rights. For Linstroth, an unflinching understanding of history and science are the only candles capable of lighting our way out of the witch craze.
By tuning into this deep dive, you are actively participating in that process.
Absolutely.
By understanding the primal mechanics of your own brain, recognizing how the amygdala drives aggression, or how oxytocin fuels in-group bias. And by looking at the history of the Counter-Reformation or the Palmer raids, you are learning to see the biological puppet strings. Recognizing how you are being manipulated is the first necessary step to cutting those strings.
Couldn't agree more.
But I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as you go about your day. Let's circle back to that physical feeling in your chest, that biological tripwire we discussed at the very beginning.
That sour milk feeling.
Right. If millions of years of evolution have hardwired our neurobiology for tribal conflict, and if the most powerful communication technologies ever invented are perfectly optimized by algorithms to exploit that exact biology, is a simple education in history and the scientific method actually a strong enough candle to keep the darkness at bay? Or, in the face of our own biology, are we just bringing a candle to a hurricane?